Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a series of podcasts, conversations, video blogs, whatever you want to call them, where myself, Glenn Ford, a game designer and developer, talks to this guy, Mike Hutchinson, also a games designer and developer. And what we do at length and for the ongoing foreseeable future is talk about designing better miniatures games. So we've been having various conversations, sort of in our sort of outside of these conversations.
You think we don't prepare for these conversations, gentle listener.
You couldn't
You'd be
tell it.
partially correct, but also we can't stop blabbing about it.
Yeah, we talk about the things we're going to talk about. We don't necessarily write things down and make notes, but we talk about it a lot. And what we've been talking about recently, amongst other things, is the difference or what we mean by simulation and emulation in relation to tabletop games.
And
And
this is a specific meaning which I caught from the lovely Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff podcast a while back, um which is Robin D. Law's RPG designer extraordinaire caught upon this usage of emulation, which he specifically meant to mean. Well, I've got there's a definition of it in an article that they published on the Pelgrane Press thing. He meant it to compare between games that focus on simulation, resolve events as they would unfold in a causal reality, or games engage in emulation so that events unfold as they would in a movie or a book to keep the narrative running in a satisfying manner. And I suspect he had to invent this term after making Feng Shui in the or Feng Shui in the 90s, which was like a very much like a genre steeped Hong Kong action movie RPG where everything that he made, like all the design decisions in that were intended at least to be like movie logic first to heck with like simulating normal reality.
well, I think because the thing is, so to my mind, simulation. I think so. I think, strictly speaking, simulation is recreating a thing via different means, but the same sort of set of steps and events as would take place in the real thing. Whereas emulation is replacing those steps in order to recreate the effect, but not taking the same actual steps. So, for example, if I wanted to simulate hitting you with a baseball bat, I could hit you with a 2x4, a wooden 2x4. It wouldn't
Mhm.
be the same thing, but I would simulate almost exactly the same result. If I wanted to emulate it, I could stick some electrodes in your brain, and I could cause you to have pain responses, and I could like go in surgically and alter your face so that it appears to have been bruised and battered, for example.
Yeah, I guess the problem is that trying to get to canonical definitions of these words is useless because like simulation and emulation in computer science mean something quite specific, and you emulate hardware by like literally reproducing the conditions on which it will be executed, which is actually way more like simulation in this meaning. But we don't mean it. We mean it in Robin D. Laws's. Well, I mean it in Robin D. Laws's sort of movie logic sense of the word, which is we're emulating the tropes of a genre rather than simulating causal events. And to a degree, I think that the root of it here is important to me because Gygaxian role playing, to the best of my knowledge, having not played it in the 70s, but being aware of both, the original texts and the OSR, seems to be like you breathe life into a somewhat realistic fantasy world, and you let its clockwork operate, and through that you discover fun stories and magical things happen, but it has to tick like clockwork, otherwise you're cheating. And I think Feng Shui says bollocks to that. Let's cheat. Movies cheat, stories cheat. Let's cheat because narrative's important, not like clockwork.
Yeah, I think the sort of for me the sort of analogy for simulation and emulation to me is a sort of possibly apocryphal story from the movie Marathon Man, where Dustin Hoffman, being a method actor, came on set and he was all sweaty and out of breath. And Sir Gilgood said, "Oh dear boy, what's wrong?" He said, "Well, my character has been running a marathon, so I've been out running, and I've been running and running and running, and he's all sweaty and exhausted." And Gilgood said, "Well, that's why we call it acting, you see." And that's Hoffman is simulating somebody who's been running, and Gilgood would emulate somebody who'd been running by going, "Oh, oh, oh, I am very
Yeah, no,
tired."
I think that's yeah, that works for me. That as a comparison, that definitely works. I think we're on the same page there.
But I think that in relation to game design, I really, when I think of these two things in games, I honestly don't think either of those things particularly to them. What I think, and I think is close to your idea of it, is that if I'm doing something that's emulating a moment, I'm hitting on the story beats and the emotional moments and the things that appear to be right to the feeling of it, as opposed to if I'm trying to simulate something, I'm trying to go through the steps of what are agreed sort of the processes of physics to do a given thing. So
Yeah,
like if something's happening that has a lot of emotional weight to it, in life we sometimes feel like things slow down and they get more detailed, and we can sort of feel like more of the bits of what are happening, as opposed to when I'm making chicken parmigiano or whatever, and everything just blurs into one meaningless mass. And when I emulate that sensation in a game, it's like, okay, well, these are the boring things. This is the making pasta part of the game. I'll put like maybe one, two resolution systems. Oh, and then this is the very exciting thing. This is the kissing the girl. This is the doing whatever. Let's put loads and loads of resolution systems here, because that's me emulating the feeling of life slowing down and speeding up and focusing and concentrating,
yeah,
as opposed to if I was trying to do something simulationist, it's like you get out the thing, you use the thing has a certain result, the person has a reaction to the thing, then the person gets out a thing, and it's like everything has the same rhythm and beats, because this is what we perceive as like the reality of physics, cause and effect. For me, simulationism in a game is like everything needs to have one step, and everything chains along, and everything makes sense, and I don't put in more steps than it feels like the causal reality would have to have. So for
yeah, and I suppose there's and for me it bleeds somewhat fuzzily into the idea of like skipping out those steps or even making things happen that are illogical and that don't have a cause and effect like that for me a lot of that is like the movie logic that I like to build into my sort of miniature game so that there is like cinematic physics. So I'm trying to think of a good example from maybe A Billion Suns, but like there are things that I want to do not because they make logical sense, but they're cool and they feel like the movies. And so as well as like you say, like dragging the camera focus in or out, fast forwarding through boring sections because, we don't need to see what the characters arriving at the airport. They arrive at the airport. Here we are. That's what our resolution system decision making is doing. Like, you know, in X-Wing, we don't have a big resolution system for how we get from the spaceship to the battle area. We just start deployed in the battle area. Like that is the sort of basic camera pulling trick. But I think it's also the case that um, uh, when I think about designing a game that's focused more on emulation than simulation, I think I'm also wrapped up in perhaps some baggage, which is saying I choose not to um ascribe intrinsic value to making it realistic, even though I perceive that like it's possible to make it realistic or not realistic. I choose not realistic because it's more realistic it's more evoking of the genre or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that sort of simulation, because nothing we're doing with these sorts of games on the tabletop can truly, I think, earn the name simulation. It's always some version of emulation. Nothing I'm, you know, uh, the sorts of tabletop games that are actual simulations are like, dexterity games and things where you're actually, playing golf by hitting something, across the tabletop. Everything we're doing is some form of emulation. Rolling dice has nothing to do with hitting somebody with a sword, and is no way a simulation of hitting somebody with a sword. um
Right, but the obvious. Sorry, no, carry on. Finish your point because I think you're
I
probably going to
just
make the same point.
I was just going to sort of say, but I think that simulation in these sorts of games is its own genre with its own tropes and its own steps. And I think it's interesting how often you can, like, if you play with that and you pull it around and you make it a bit more movie logical and a bit more emulationist, you will find players coming back with a sort of, but this isn't how things happen. This isn't how things should happen, because they're on this sort of, they're sort of more caught in the genre tropes of what has been represented as simulationism within particularly historical gaming, I think, personally.
So I guess the problem I've got with that, and it's not something I have a deep expertise in, so I'm sort of grasping here. But like, I was talking about Harpoon, the early '80s naval game, which I kind of bumped into as part of doing my research for Pacific Command. But it, is in and of itself fairly kind of infamous and noteworthy, and that is. Not an unplayably detailed game. Like it's not that one where you have a trillion tokens and it takes you 6 years to play 6 years of World War II. I forget what it's called right now. The campaign for West Africa, North
Oh,
Africa, or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
It's not that. It's much more sensible than that. But at its heart, it is rooted in the professional wargaming mindset of what we are here to do ultimately is a reflection of what professional wargaming is, which is let's use the tools that we have in front of us to, as best as we can, sort of understand the enemy, predict our own tactics, strategy, success. I've got this lovely book on my shelf here about it's called Winning in the Pacific, I think is what it's called. It's obscured right now, so I can't remember the title. And that's about the what the US naval guys did to actually literally war game out on the tabletop ahead of some of the conflicts in World War II. And with that mindset, I think like the word simulation carries some significant meaning there, which is, yes, we are abstracting. Of course, we're abstracting, but what we're trying to do is abstract to the point where, with the right inputs, we get a believable set of outputs, and those outputs are actually usable, to make decisions that might affect real life. And the real life part of it gives it weight, but the project, the purpose of the project is to create a simulation that, at least at some level of abstraction, behaves like the real world. You give it inputs and it does real worldy type outputs, and perhaps if you run it n number of times you get a statistically significant output, and you're like, oh, okay, this is a better or a worse decision. And so I think for me, a lot of uh, the baggage or the assumptions around the need to move away from movie logic and be realistic in the way that you produce your games is because of that. That's the echoes of that stuff that still bounces around all of miniature games, all of war games on some level, because although we are, as writers of fantasy miniature games, very far from that. We don't play those games, we don't read those games very often. Like we're all part of like a culture and a community of stuff that has that inside it, and lots of it comes from. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think I am to a degree a bit confused and mixed up in, and need to pull apart my understanding of some of those sensations, where it's like I like what Robin D. Laws is trying to do by pulling away like games that are more like clockwork and more interested in causal reality as a way of creating ludic spaces, as opposed to simulation, because what I need is reliable inputs and outputs.
well, and I think that's one of the things is that, because you can have simulation of movie moments and you can have emulation of like historical reality. And I think that a game which is trying to let you war game out like reality in such a way that you could predict what is going to happen or recreate what did happen, we'll have to at some point put in emulational steps, just because people sat at a war game table don't have the emotional investment with what is happening, to the troops that are being sacrificed, don't have the same sort of connection, the same sort of realities. And in order to have those realities within your simulation, you're going to have to emulate the fact that you are sending a human being to their death when you are not. You know what I mean? And I think those, and you need.
Okay, right. So you're yeah, because you're sort of saying like we didn't go through the motions enough to have method acting. What we need to do is just acting. Let's just pretend these guys are going to flee the battlefield at this point.
Yeah, or just it's like I can go through the statistics of like gun ranges and lethality, whatever, and I can sort of create that with dice so that a gun that is X% lethal at X range in reality will be X% lethal at the same scale range on my tabletop. I can simulate the effect of the gun being shot by a reasonably well trained soldier at another soldier. What I cannot simulate is whether or not I'm willing to put a man in front of a bullet, and whether I'm willing to accept a Pyrrhic victory, whether I'm willing to, you know, okay, this unit is unit, pawn sacrifice. They're going to die horribly so that everybody else wins the battle. And it's
Mm,
like, those are things where a simulation doesn't necessarily recreate reality. And
mm,
sometimes we want to put in rules saying, okay, even though you could totally sacrifice this person, in order to win the battle, we're going to put in like victory points and things like that to say, just like blowing up a baby isn't necessarily going to be a viable option to you just because it is a viable option to you. And so I
mm.
think I think there are definitely moments where in order to recreate reality, you have to engage in emulation, more than simulation in these sorts of situations, because you've got to emulate the player not being a man sat at a table pushing around bits of plastic. you
Hmm.
can you can simulate the relationship between the two bits of plastic to be the relationship between two people with rifles. You can't simulate me being a general putting men to their death.
Right. So to put it another way, we're sort of saying like we can build rules and mechanics and systems inside our games that, like a flight simulator, allows us to like if we hit the right speed, we achieve some lift, and if we steer the plane correctly, we can get off the runway. What we can't really do is then inside that like video game or flight simulator sort of machinery, like simulate the fact that you've got a crew of people behind you and you're about to crash, and what you're going to do in that situation. Like on some level, there's things that we can connect with in a, I don't know if it's a logical or a cold way, but it's like it's a systemic sort of clockworky nuts and bolts kind of a way. And there are things that just aren't available to inverted commas simulate in that way, and we have to rely on different strategies and techniques. And I suppose the only point of trying to make this distinction, other than like it's an interesting thing that I've been thinking about with this thing from Robin D. Laws for a while now. I think it's important to figure out, like I can sort of wave my hands and go, oh, it's movie logic. But I think I just find it important to figure out like what is the difference between my intention when I'm writing a system, writing a mechanic, writing a rule, and where am I okay with what feels like more cause and effect thing, or sort of when people look at a rule or they're play testing something that I've written and are going like, no, it doesn't feel realistic, it doesn't feel right. Like this is just a diagnostic tool to be like, well, does it feel wrong because it's not meeting the genre tropes, or does it feel wrong because like it's essentially a set of like understandable physical processes and you've guffed them up and they don't work, and now it's like, which is sort of like how collisions in Gaslands, like people come at them the first time and go, well, the simulation of the physics is garbage. This, I hate collisions. And then you go, yeah, but think about Fast and the Furious. And they're like, oh, okay, fine, I get it. And they kind of switch their mindset from simulation to emulation, and now they're cool. Now they're okay with the collision system.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, like there where you're saying, oh, think of Fast and the Furious. Again, we come back so many times in these conversations. They're about setting player expectations
Mm,
and setting out your stall and explaining what you're trying to do with your game. Because I more and more as I kind of I'm not that bothered about either simulating or emulating like physical reality. I'm interested in emulating feelings within a player. That's really what
mm,
I'm trying to do. And it's like we were saying there where people say, oh, it doesn't feel realistic, it doesn't feel right. And I think those are two very different things. And it's like I unless I'm creating a specific sort of game that I haven't yet, wanted to try and create, I don't care if it feels realistic. I really care if it doesn't feel right, if it
mm.
doesn't feel appropriate, if it doesn't match with the stall I set out. And
Yeah.
if I'm going to design a game that is like, oh, super crunchy, realistic World War II simulator, and somebody says, oh, that didn't seem realistic. What that soldier did that didn't seem realistic. That's a real problem.
Mm.
If I'm doing, whatever, my pulp pirate game, it's like, it's fine that it is not realistic. Jack Sparrow does not act in a realistic fashion.
No, in fact it's the opposite. It's like if it is realistic, it would be wrong.
Yes, it would be very problematic. Yes, if the pirates,
Yeah, like if like Jack Sparrow just suffers like a crippling broken leg and there's like splintered bone everywhere, you're like, well, this is not the genre I was looking for.
yeah, this is not what I turned up for. Just for first time he lands off of a
Yeah, yeah.
just,
Swings over on the deck. It's like lands slightly wrong, snap.
yeah, no, absolutely. I'm trying to do a thing. I'm trying to make you feel like you're in a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. So realism is of no concern to me. But
Yeah, and I think probably for this podcast, we're probably preaching to the converted. But like, I think as I grew up as a games designer in the '90s, like that was not clear from the games that I was reading. There was seems to me a very intrinsic push that was like, no, no, simulating is correct, not simulating is incorrect. And I think that like probably the reason that Robin D. Laws invented this term is because he was fighting against that current status quo and people being like, yeah, I mean, so I think I think we're well beyond that point, but at the same time, I feel like that's important, and we so I just wanted to stick a nice magic marker pen around that.
no, absolutely, and I think one of the nature of a game that is about people, figures moving through space and interacting with each other is that the one genre that everybody has experience of is reality.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Everybody knows what it is like to walk across a street and go
Mm.
through a door, and everybody knows how fast the average person can run and what it would be like to dive through a window.
Right,
Maybe.
but none of that has anything to do with Jason Bourne movies. Like none of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so and again, it's like sort of trying to go back to sort of saying, okay, look, I know that this isn't how people climb up the side of buildings. I know that this is not how the average person jumps from one rooftop to another, but we are not being average people today. We are being
Mm.
cyberpunk, boosted up warriors. We are being Jason Bourne. We are being whatever we are being. And let's all come together and say, okay, these are the new realities. If I deviate from those,
Mm.
you're legit in like piling on me. But if what I'm doing is, if what you're being is like, oh, what the hell, you never reload your gun. Well, of course I never reload my gun. It's an American action film from the 90s. No one
Yeah.
reloads their gun, you
This
know.
this conversation makes me curious about how often my imagination goes back to the Xbox game Crackdown for no good reason. Like it's probably like I don't know, it's probably like actually a terrible game when you compare it to lots of other things. But like just what you're saying there, like the the willful disregard that that game had for like how far you could jump, and the fact that the more you jumped, the more you could jump. And at one point, you know, after jumping quite a lot, you can just jump up an entire like 6-story building. And like it just sets the expectation of that quite early on, and then just wraps it in a lot of nonsense. So you're like, at no point are you analyzing the fact that, you know, your dude can jump 6 floors up. You're just like, woohoo.
Well, yeah, and it's like one of my favorite series of other videos is a guy who, you know, takes games and then does a thing that shouldn't work but does work in order to point out how stupid the game is. You know, it's like a falling from a 6-story building in order to get better at jumping because it works. You know,
Yeah.
and yeah, you know, I think a lot of games, yeah, you have to sort of set out your stall. You have to say, look, this is the reality we're living in. Nothing, I think, on the tabletop is strictly, you know, can sort of say is a true simulation. Everything is trying to achieve a given goal, and that goal might be to get you to act the way that a platoon commander in World War II acts. It
Yeah.
might be trying to get you to act the way that Jason Bourne acts. It might be getting him to act the way that Jack Sparrow acts. They
Mhm.
are all choices in emulating, you know, a reality on the tabletop. And that choice can be somewhere on the pole from what would be simulation if we could simulate things through to, you know, emulation, which is kind of what they all are.
Mm.
Um, but it's all just choices about what you're trying to recreate, what you're trying to give your players as an experience, and what the sort of what your stall is that you're setting out for the world in which your game exists.
All right.
Okay, I think that's an acceptable examination of simulation and
Yeah.
emulation. These are very much like, you know, as I say, a combination of our definitions, and you know, I'm aware that these aren't like hard and fast, correct, you know, correct definitions of these technical terms. So I'm sure that other people are going to have their own versions of what simulation and emulation means to them within a tabletop game. Maybe you
Or what you mean, or what maybe you use to refer to like movie logic and physics.
yeah, reality and other reality and non-reality and all those sorts of things. Please do swing down into the comments section if that's you, and tell us like what simulation means to you, what reality means to you within these games, you know, where emulation is, what you think of as movie logic, what you think of as emotional logic, you know, all those sorts of things.
And
Swing.
I particularly, I'd love to hear from people if they feel like they've read or played a game that they felt was emblematic of simulation, because I think that's the thing that I've got the least experience of, because I come from a genre dripping sort of fantasy world and haven't played a lot of what people might consider simulation games. So yeah, I'm super interested to hear what people think of from that side of things.
Cool. Tell us about that. While you're down there telling us about it, do hit the likes and subscribe buttons. Swing by our Discord, tell us about it over there, and then swing by Mike's Patreon and give us money to assist us in wanting to continue doing this.
The
Uh,
more coffee I drink, the more definitions I will invent.
the more coffee or the more high quality whiskey, either or, whatever the money goes on. But for now, and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.
Cheerio.